Hi there and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to give you a quick walk through the front lines in Ukraine. Not a lot of it's happened, but there's a few talking points. Let's return to the Kharkiv counteroffensive that we've learnt about over this last week. This is this lightning quick counteroffensive that basically entailed the Ukrainians punching through the front lines of the Russians with some armor, and then after that, on very quick equipment, they got behind the Russian lines using what's known as a terrain-orientated attack, sort of a maneuver warfare, rather than an attritional warfare, which is a force-orientated attack. Talked about that a little bit yesterday. And the Ukrainians punched through the lines. There was no tiered defences, so they got in behind and then caused merry havoc. Now, this requires a lot of training. This is very NATO-style operation in the sense that you've got decision-making going on further down the hierarchy. This is not the Soviet style of warfare the Russians have, which is a really centralized top-down approach to warfare. Let me just read you a little bit of an article that was originally in the Philadelphia Business Journal, and this is taking the Ukrainian approach to warfare and applying it to business. Okay, so what Ukrainian non-commissioned officers, those are called NCOs, can teach us about leadership. And there's just some interesting quotes in here. So Chief Master Sergeant Konstantin Stanislavchuk of the Ukrainian Air Force addressed the Senior Enlisted Leaders International Summit on August 1st. He said, quote, "I believe the Sergeant Corps played an important role in our success. After all, the actions of small army units are managed by our junior commanders. The sergeants of the armed forces, without waiting for instructions, took the initiative to conduct independent small operations and act independently and resourcefully. In this way, the defense forces are comparatively different from the enemy, where generals are forced to personally raise their subordinates to attack." End quote. So one can only imagine the impact of waiting for a high-ranking Russian officer to approve an operation. Warfare is in real time. Decisions must also be in real time. The Ukrainian military is mirroring the practices of those of Western nations. In a November 2019 interview, US Army Command Sergeant Major John Wayne Troxell said, quote, "NCOs are the doers, non-commissioned officers. They provide inspiration, purpose, motivation, direction, and discipline to the troops they lead, and they are also responsible for the individual training of those in their charge." So this is really indicative of what's been going on across Ukraine. They have been changing since 2014, since the initial Russian invasion of Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Ukrainians have been trained up by NATO armed forces, UK, US and others, 8 years of training, which is all about this style of warfare, giving the decision-making ability to people further down that hierarchical line. And that sort of training has really helped in offensives like this, where, they've needed that. But what's going on now is that things have not moved in a couple of days. So this front line down the Oskil River just hasn't moved. Now, what you'd expect, so some people like General Ben Hodges, who is a former army commander of the US Army in Europe, has said that, what's going on in Ukraine, both in the north and the south, shows an irreversible momentum. So he's like, the momentum is fully on the Ukrainian side, and it's irreversible. The Russians can't get back from here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it has certainly stalled up here because they need to reconstitute, they need to consolidate their forces, sort out their supply lines. Now, the flip side of that is you're losing momentum. Really, if they don't strike now, it's giving the Russians a chance to not only consolidate their own defences, but you've got to be really wary of, once you've done an offensive, or in this case, a kind of counter-offensive, you've got to be wary of the enemy doing their own counter-offensive. So actually, this would be the perfect time for Russians to make a counter-attack somewhere along this line. The problem for the Russians is they just don't have the troops. So behind those initial front lines, it's kind of been empty. There's been no tiered defense. And the Russians have lost not only a whole bunch of troops, there have been some significant POWs captured, but a lot of escaped, but they've lost a lot of equipment. Okay, and they need to be retooled. So they're not in a good position to do their counteroffensive themselves, but Ukraine need to be on the lookout for that. The other thing that Ukraine need to be thinking about, I mean, I don't know what happened here, but in these sorts of offensives, you had something called follow and support. So you have almost like two units, if you like, where you'd have one unit doing like the warfare, and if they get exhausted or they have to process loads of prisoners, then the unit behind them then takes over, and you kind of have this, alternating between them, the follow and support. And one would assume that they've had that, and they are bringing in people like the military police and government officials to start properly governing this area, even though they've only just taken it. The thing about the Russians producing a counterattack is that the Ukrainians will have a lot of intelligence going on here. There's going to be a lot of, if you like, collaborators, but in a good way, good collaborators with the Ukrainians behind the Russian lines who are Ukrainian citizens with mobile phones and the ability to communicate with other Ukrainians, such that if a big counteroffensive is being mounted by the Russians, the Ukrainians will know about it, and that's a real challenge for the Russians. So there's not been a lot of movement there. There's not even been a lot of movement in Kherson. What has happened in Kherson? I mean, it's obviously all still going on here. And really, what the Ukrainians want is to advance a little bit more so that their artillery can safely hit the left-hand bank of the Dnipro River over this western side of the river. That would really benefit the Ukrainians. But there's not been a lot of movement. However, we have this the city or town, Kryvyi Rih, which is sitting on an artificial lake that is dammed. And what the Russians did, so the Russians, after the counteroffensives, hit a bunch of power stations and power supply infrastructure as a kind of retaliation. Now, some say that was a retaliation not for counteroffensives, but for the Ukrainians refusing to do a negotiation. So interestingly, after those counteroffensives, the Russians apparently tried to negotiate with Ukraine, and Ukraine refused. So as a kind of retaliation to that, the Russians hit power infrastructure, and now what they've done is they've hit this dam here, and that is pretty important. Why it's important is because that dam feeds the Inhulets River that goes down broadly what was the front line and still is a front line for a large part of that Kherson front, and that the hope was not only to cause mayhem with regard to water. So it turns out that everyone living Kryvyi Rih has gone out and bought all the water they can get because they're worried about a water shortage due to the dam being bust, and it's caused loads of panic. And the river has raised 3 meters and more, and has washed bridges and stuff down here. And then this affects this part of the front line in Kherson, because then the Ukrainians are going to struggle to get supply across that river because it's now flooded. So this is pretty clever from the Russians. The sort of thing that they probably should have been doing, a long time ago. They're now starting to be a little bit more tactical in what they're doing, rather than just flattening places and then moving in. They need to be quite clever. Now, as horrible as this is, you could argue is a fairly clever move for the Russians. We'll see how that develops. It appears that the Ukrainians are on top of that, of fixing the dam and sort of sorting out the initial huge problems there. But that is a real challenge. So there has been no movement really along the Oskil front, no movement in Liman and Lysychansk. These areas have remained. There's been attempts by Russia in a Bakhmut area to make a few probing attacks, nothing that they haven't already been doing. And we're going to talk about the troops that are involved in that. But first of all, I'll just talk about what could be the next move for the Ukrainians. Now, there's perhaps sort of a massing of forces down here in the corner between the kind of north-south line and the east-west line here. In the corner, it could be that is where the Ukrainians decide to attack. So I talked about how Donetsk could be the next objective, and it could be a pincer movement coming from the top down and from this corner here, and that could still be, very much an objective. But what Zelensky originally wanted to do, his first choice was to go for Mariupol. So Mariupol, to pronounce it probably more accurately, but I don't know, it has obviously been a really big sore point for the Ukrainians. They held on there for so long, and then the Azov battalion and other sort of units were surrendered on the understanding that there would be a prisoner swap, and then that didn't really happen. So they are now, some of them have been disappeared. There have been prisons that have been supposedly bombed by the Ukrainians, but actually they were hit by the Russians, and that's a war crime that needs to be investigated. And that, full of these particularly Azov battalion members that the Russians particularly hate. But anyway, so Mariupol is a bit of a sore point, and so it could be that the Ukrainians are going to maybe attack in this corner and maybe do a pincer movement around Mariupol rather than Donetsk. I mean, it's all about troop numbers. If you are attacking urban areas, I mean, at the very minimum in war, you want a 3-to-1 advantage when you are on the offensive. But if you're attacking urban areas, you want 6-7-1. Going through these sort of towns, you're going to want probably 5-1. But the idea is you're going to need a shed load of troops to do such an offensive. Now, the question is, two questions. A, do the Ukrainians have those troop numbers? And B, what's the resistance like? Because if the resistance is as thin as it was up in Kharkiv area, then actually these sort of things could be relatively simple. Now, we have a pretty good sense that the Russians are in desperate straits. How do we know that? Well, since July the 1st, the Russians have been recruiting prisoners from prisons and saying, we will get rid of your sentence if you come and join us in the war and fight for us for 6 months or whatever. And particularly the Wagner mercenaries, the mercenaries who are active around Bakhmut. So this is a really has been a hotly contested area for some weeks, and here as well. So the Wagner mercenaries, I think that's Pisky, have been fairly successful. They have been the better troops. There's no doubt about it. The Wagner mercenaries have been the better troops for the Russians. But even they are having recruitment problems. They've been putting up posters around and billboards around Moscow and on buses and whatnot. But here we have a renewed recruitment drive in prisons. And just have a little listen to Prigozhin, who's this guy who's the infamous leader of the PMC, private military company, the Wagner Group, that has been so active around Africa, the Middle East, Syria. They do a lot of Russia's dirty work just under the radar.
Наверное, слышали, ЧВК «Вагнер» называется. Война тяжелая. На всякие там чеченские и так далее близко не похоже. Расход боеприпасов у меня приблизительно в 2,5 раза больше, чем в Сталинграде. Первый грех – это дезертирство. Никто не дает заднюю. Никто не отступает. Никто не сдается в плен. Когда вы будете обучаться, при сдаче в плен вам расскажут 2 гранаты, которые вы должны иметь с собой. Второй грех – это алкоголь, наркотики. В зоне боевых действий. Пока полгода вы с нами, вы все время в зоне боевых действий. И третий грех – это мародерка. включая сексуальные контакты с местными женщинами, флорой, фауной, мужчинами, там, с кем угодно. Минимальный возраст, который мы берем, это 22 года. Если моложе, бумажка от ближайших родственников, что они не против. Максимальный возраст, условно, это 50 лет, но если крепкий, прямо здесь на собеседовании делаем элементарные тесты, смотрим, насколько крепок, физическая форма крайне необходима. Смотрим, насколько ты крепок, и тогда принимаем решение и берем. Первые заключенные, которые воевали со мной, это было 1 июня, штурм Угледарской ТЭЦ, 40 человек из Питера, строгий режим, рецидив. 40 человек зашло в окопы противника, вырезали его ножами, было 3 погибших, 7 раненых. С 3 погибших одному было 52 года, отсижена 30-ка. Погиб геройски. Мы внимательно относимся к тем, кто сидит под...
So that's absolutely fascinating stuff. It goes on, but what that tells you is, one, you know, the minimum age is 22, but hey, if we get a letter from your family saying that's fine, then we can go younger, and the maximum age is 50, but hey, if you're fit and we'll give you a test, then that's fine. In other words, we'll take anyone, and, you know, although it's going to be tough, you can't do these sins of alcohol, drugs, looting, and sexual misdemeanors, but guaranteed that's all kind of going on anyway. They are taking on, you know, some of the worst criminals. And that's how desperate Russia are. Absolutely desperate to get anyone they can without doing a full national mobilization. So they are getting prisoners to fight for them in their mercenary companies, which then the government can keep them at arm's length and not really take responsibility for what they do. It's all really indicative again of the tough bind that Russia is presently in. So what else is going on? Well, if we go down to Kherson again, there's a little bit of land south of Kherson here. I'm going to show you on this tweet that shows it more accurately. Now, this is completely unconfirmed, so this could be absolute rumor, but there is a rumor that 5 boatloads full of troops have landed here, and you know this could be a way of the Ukrainians sort of flanking the Russians with some special forces or whoever they are. So that could be something to look out for. It could be interesting, or nothing might come of it, and it could be a load of rubbish. You know, there you go. What else do I have to say? There are, oops, I've just got rid of that. 30 to 40% chance that the Russian army will collapse by Christmas and the war in Ukraine will come to an end. That's Edward Stringer, the Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the RAF. That's a pretty staggering number. And actually, you're starting to see a lot of pundits and a lot of military experts and retired generals and what have you saying that, do you know what? This really could be the turning point. This could be the beginning of the end. We will see how it goes. There are so many variables at play. But remember, I talked to you a little bit about sabotage going on in Russia. Well, again, another major rail incident in Russia. Sabotage group has claimed responsibility. And here, a locomotive carrying oil was derailed in Nizhny-Kamsk, and that's in the Republic of Tatarstan. So here you have, you know, more issues for the Russians, as they have some of their own people causing, you know, some serious headache for them. So stuff is going on, but there's not been a lot of action on the fronts. So it's a guessing time for what the Ukrainians are going to do. We have had Russia hitting that dam, but essentially it's still attritional warfare going on down here, that force-orientated warfare. And then we're looking to see whether anything again will happen in this Kharkiv offensive, whether they'll continue with that momentum, or whether they'll hold those lines there and then concentrate somewhere else. You know, it seems that really Lyman and Severodonetsk, there's things going on there. So it looks like there are intentions for the Ukrainians to make something of that. But will something happen down here? There's going to be calculations about where the weakest point is. And we know, again, I mean, we did know this anyway, but we know that the Americans, it came out again, that they are providing real-time intelligence for the Ukrainians. You know, that's going to be satellite intelligence, that's going to be all sorts. And you can bet your bottom dollar, and in fact, I kind of know this, that special forces are operating in Ukraine. If they're not, like, for example, the SAS are operating, even if they're not operating on the front lines, they are operating behind, you know, training people up and working out exactly where to hit and how to do it. There was the airstrip in Crimea that was hit, the Saki airstrip that was hit, and there's still, although Ukraine have come out and said actually it was hit by, you know, rockets, there's a lot of evidence suggests actually it was special forces. So, you know, stuff's going on all the time, even if there isn't movement along the front lines. But anyway, there you go. That's a shorter one today because not so much movement. It's just a case of trying to predict what will happen. One other thing to add is that there have been reports, or not just reports, this is what is happening. Over the last few days, the Azerbaijan government have been quite opportunistic. So Azerbaijan and Armenia, two countries here, one bordering the Caspian Sea, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and not too far from Ukraine. We've had Georgian troops helping out people in Ukraine, but also Chechen troops helping out the Russians. Now, down here, there's been a long-running feud between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and that has been, peace deals have been brokered by Russia. Russia have sorted out the peace between the two nations. Well, it turns out that after the counterattacks in Ukraine, where Russia looked absolutely hammered, Azerbaijan appeared to think that, now's an opportunistic time, a good time to restart this feud with Armenia. And there have been border clashes between the two countries. And Russia has traditionally helped out Armenia, but, you know, who knows what's going to take place here? Is this something that Azerbaijan are going to take advantage of because Russia don't have the ability to sort out issues between these two countries because their attention is very much taken elsewhere with what's going on in Ukraine. So that's really interesting. There's now presently a ceasefire, but you know that's happened before and they've broken that. So that's something to look out for. And not only is there this opportunistic fighting going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, there's been some border clashes there as well. Again, why now? Well, it seems pretty obvious that Russia is not in a good place to be able to become the kind of Stan country's policeman. They are very much contained with the issues going on in Ukraine. So I don't know whether these will become more and more problematic for Russia or whether Russia just gives up on them. But that's certainly an interesting piece of geopolitical news going on in that part of the world. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please, like, subscribe and do all that stuff. And any thanks would be really appreciated. And until next time, toodle pips.